a story that when we used to come home from haying or something of that nature, well, Grandpa Burton, Thomas Burton, I was like the 14th in his family because my father died before I was born, and so I went to live with the grandparents. And McKay and I grew up like brothers. Building was a little older, but anyway, when we'd come and we'd sit around the fire, we had a big pot-bellied stove. That was the way we heated the house. You didn't have any furnaces or anything of that nature. Didn't have any lights. We had coil oil lamps that were on a little shelf by the stair, and as you went up to bed, you'd light your coil oil lamp and take it up to bed. And if it was very cold, we used to heat rocks or flat irons, and you'd wrap them in paper, newspaper, and take them up to bed with you and put them down in the bed. And McKay and I always used to wear our Levi's to bed anyway because it was so cold in the winter. But anyway, I can remember this one night we came home from getting some hay. We put our hay up in the fields, and that was a dumb thing to do because in the wintertime you had to go down with a team after school and get a load of hay. And it was very, very cold. And when we came home, Grandma had some chocolate for us, and we sat around this pot-belly stove, and Grandpa told this story about John Brown. Now, John Brown was a dairy farmer, and this was when the valley was first settled here, one of the first settlers, and he lost his cows. And he went out trying to find his cows. And the valley, there were no fences. You know, it was a wilderness area. And so he got lost up in the mountains. And he was trying to find his cows and trying to find his way home. And it was getting darker and darker. And he'd call out, "I'm John Brown and I'm lost." And the echo would go down through the valley there. And in a little while, it started to get about this dark. And he knew he was in trouble because he could hear the wolves. They were going, "Oh, woo, woo." And you'd hear one wolf on one mountain go, "Oh, woo, woo." And it'd be answered by another wolf, "Oh, woo." And so these wolves were getting closer and closer. And John Brown was really worried because he knew these wolves were after him. And he hadn't found his cows, and he was in trouble with the wolves coming, and he was lost. And he finally found a little settler's little log cabin up in the mountains there at the south end of the valley. And he got in this cabin, but the doors and windows had been all broken down and weren't in very good shape. And he tried to build them back as quick as he could. And in a few minutes, he heard the wolves gathering all around, howling right around the cabin. And he didn't know whether the door would hold him. And he tried to close up the window. The window was partly open, and the wolves were jumping up. And by that time, it was dark. And so he could see the wolves' eyes, you know, the way they glisten in the moonlight. And he was, of course, terribly frightened. And he finally boarded up the window as best he could, and then they started to hit at the door. And these wolves were just snarling and growling. And finally, it was a very small cabin, and they were breaking down the door, and he knew he had no chance. So the thing that he did, it was a small enough log cabin so that he braced his legs and pushed from one side to the other, and he held himself up there, and finally the wolves broke in, but they would jump up in the air and try to grab him, and they couldn't get him quite. And so finally he had to stay there all night, propped up against the cabin. And finally the wolves left, and eventually John Brown got out of the cabin. It was morning, and he was still calling, "I'm John Brown and I'm lost." And his cows, they all came home, and his family, of course, they missed him, and finally his family was coming up to find him, and they did find him. And that's the story of John Brown and how he got lost.